Good evening and welcome to Poland Daily. I'm Natalia Moczulska and this is the news. An emergency session of the Warsaw City Council has been called in connection with the CBA's detention of the city's secretary, former Treasury Minister Włodzimierz Karpiński. The capital's councillors expect an explanation. The mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski, was invited to the session but did not appear. Today's meeting was called at the request of law and justice counselors who are demanding detailed explanations from the Warsaw mayor. We believe that in this situation, an explanation is needed from the mayor who appointed Mr. Karpiński as secretary. And I remind you, previously Mr. Karpiński was the president of the MPO company. Włodzimierz Karpiński had been president of the municipal cleaning company since December 2019. In April 2021, he was appointed as secretary of the city. It was during his tenure that rigged tenders amounting to 600 million zloty were said to have taken place. In return, Karpiński was to receive 5 million zloty in cash. On Wednesday, the court decided on a 3-month jail term for the politician. He was taken into custody for 90 days on suspicion of corruption and this web of connections that has formed around MPO. Karpiński previously served as Treasury Minister from 2013 to 2015. His detention is related to an investigation that in early February arrested, among others, Rafał Baniak, a former Deputy Treasury Minister from 2011 to 2015. According to investigators, he was the one who headed an organized criminal group. I will not comment on the charges because I'm not a prosecutor or investigator. I know Mr. Karpiński from the old days. He was for me a model of personal integrity and decency. On Wednesday morning, Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski announced the suspension of Włodzimierz Karpiński from his duties as city secretary. As for Mr. Trzaskowski's responsibility, considering how the cost of garbage collection has increased during his term of office, and this is an increase of more than 3 times, well, such political responsibility is obvious. In 2018, waste management cost the capital City Hall more than 350 million zloty. 2 years later, it was almost 1,300 million. Removing waste from the city is a huge amount of money. Here it looks like a special system has been set up through which corrupt activities take place. The cost of garbage collection is not the only thing local government officials have complained about. Well, yes, the question of cost is always problematic. Now, in general, everything is getting more expensive, but we also had a lot of confusion about how to account for waste, whether to do it by the amount of water or by the meter. Here, neither of these methods are good. In connection with the scandal, there are questions about whether Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski will resign. He may, but does not have to. Nothing forces it on him. It depends solely on his goodwill, but here it should not be expected. At the meeting of the extraordinary session of the Council of the capital city of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski did not appear. Instead of him, answers to the questions of the councillors were given by Deputy Mayor Michał Olszewski. Day 373 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The General Staff of the Ukraine Armed Forces reports more successes. A Su-25 attack aircraft, an Mi-24 helicopter, and 7 drones have been shot down in the past 24 hours. In contrast, the situation in Bakhmut is much more difficult. An advisor to the head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Jan Garin, reported that Russian forces have virtually surrounded the city. The Ukrainians are slowly withdrawing their forces from Bakhmut, and the situation for the defenders is becoming increasingly difficult. Russian troops have destroyed a bridge on the last access route to the city previously controlled by Ukrainian forces. Currently, Ukrainians can only get to Bakhmut via muddy dirt roads. The Wall Street Journal reports that the U.S., Germany, and France are increasingly pressuring Ukraine to sit down for peace negotiations if it does not regain its lost territories by fall.
And every time we are less successful on the front line, we see the spike in discussions. Okay, maybe it's time to sit down. Maybe it's time for Ukraine to make concessions. Oh, they're not capable of doing this. This is not going anywhere. We've heard it. We've been there. We've seen it. I mean, this doesn't work. But there must be a fundamental narrative that Ukraine can win, it will win, and we will do everything what it takes to achieve that as long as it takes. This is the biggest challenge that we have to work on, that support does not get dependent on the state of play on the front line.
The authorities in Kyiv are adamant about the position they outlined as recently as last year in the form of 10 conditions that Moscow should meet before peace negotiations begin. Among them are the cessation of attacks and the withdrawal of Russian troops from the occupied territories. Meanwhile, Moscow is not about to relent. The number of victims of yesterday's attack on a residential building in Zaporizhia has risen to 5. The brutal Russian missile attack on Zaporizhia will be met with our military and legal response. The occupier will inevitably feel our strength, the strength of justice in every sense of the word. I want to thank all our rescuers who cleared the rubble after the missile destroyed the block. They managed to save 11 people, and more than 70 were helped. Ukrainians are demanding that officials at the highest levels of the Russian government be held criminally responsible. A special international tribunal would be set up for this purpose, to try them as accomplices in war crimes. London believes the process could be expedited using the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
These horrible crimes will be tried by Ukrainian judges in Ukraine, and it's right that that happens. One of the reasons is that because this war is very sadly still continuing, we hope that the actions of Procurator Kostin will immediately have an effect on the behavior of Russian troops.
Since February 24th of last year, Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office has documented more than 70,000 cases of Russian war crimes.
The International Criminal Court is the venue where highest political and military leadership can be brought to justice on international level. Third element of our system is, of course, international tribunal for the crime of aggression. Once again, for the highest military and political leadership of Russian Federation. Because if aggression would not have been occurred, then there would be no 70,000 war crimes committed in Ukraine. That's why it's extremely important to set up this tribunal.
Yesterday, an attack was carried out in the Russian region near the border with Ukraine on 2 villages, which Russia accuses Ukrainian forces of using NATO weapons and U.S. intelligence reconnaissance. Meanwhile, the Russian Volunteer Corps claimed responsibility for the diversionary attack.
First of all, alleging that the U.S. was somehow providing information to enable these types of attacks. What I would tell you, first of all, is, again, I don't have any information in regards to whether or not the Ukrainians have conducted these type of operations. I'd refer you to them. I can say definitively that the notion of the U.S. providing intelligence or information to the Ukrainians to target locations inside Russia is nonsense.
The West continually supports Ukraine politically, militarily, and financially. U.S. President Joe Biden will meet with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz at the White House today. The main topic of conversation is expected to be the Russian invasion and further aid to Ukraine.
You'll see us tomorrow, just unilaterally, the U.S. will have another round of assistance for Ukraine coming tomorrow. And it will include mostly ammunitions and munitions that the Ukrainians will need for the systems that they already have, like the HIMARS and the artillery. So I can't predict a specific outcome tomorrow. I wouldn't look for that, but certainly they will be discussing additional support for Ukraine going forward.
Former U.S. Army commander in Europe, General Ben Hodges, has estimated that Ukraine will regain control of Crimea by August. Taking back the peninsula, which has been occupied since 2014, would be crucial to the success of any further counteroffensive. In an interview with U.S. television station MSNBC, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki assessed that by helping Ukrainian soldiers and the Ukrainian army, Poland is contributing greatly to the stability of the entire region.
I do believe that we have to change the paradigm. We shouldn't say Russia cannot win this war and Ukraine cannot be defeated. That's too little. We have to tell very loudly Russia has to lose this war and Ukraine has to win this war. 1 week ago, a conference in Munich ended, and I recall the previous conference in Munich in 1938 when countries which were hesitating and indecisive, they apparently, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom back then brought back peace. to its country. We know how the story ended. A year later, we had a war, the Second World War in Europe, and the whole atrocities of war and everything in Poland and across Europe. So right now we have to be preemptive. If you want peace, you have to prepare for war, as the Romans said, and still this rule, this maxim is valid.
Mr. President, thank you for joining us today. President Biden was in Warsaw last week, and he said to you and to the Polish people, God bless you for your open-armed response to this war in Ukraine, to let millions of Ukrainians come across the border, to absorb them, to take care of them. I think now you have about 2 million Ukrainians in your country, down last year, but still larger than the size of Warsaw itself, for example. So how are you as a country, how are you as a society managing, absorbing, and welcoming those refugees from Ukraine?
But my government prepared all the logistics and all the elements of the jigsaw needed to accept the Ukrainians. And by the way, they are mostly mothers with children, because their husbands and brothers are on the front line fighting for sovereignty of Ukraine and for peace in Europe. So my government prepared logistics, but these were all Poles who have opened our houses and hearts for the Ukrainians, and they are still here. We are actually giving access to our education, to our healthcare system, on exactly the same footing as Polish citizens have, and also social security system. So they feel here at home.
Mr. President, thank you for joining us today. President Biden was in Warsaw last week, and he said to you and to the Polish people, God bless you for your open-armed response to this war in Ukraine, to let millions of Ukrainians come across the border, to absorb them, to take care of them. I think now you have about 2 million Ukrainians in your country, down last year, but still larger than the size of Warsaw itself, for example. So how are you as a country, how are you as a society managing, absorbing, and welcoming those refugees from Ukraine?
But my government prepared all the logistics and all the elements of the jigsaw needed to accept the Ukrainians. And by the way, they are mostly mothers with children, because their husbands and brothers are on the front line fighting for sovereignty of Ukraine and for peace in Europe. They feel here like at home.
Earlier today, after a brief delay, a SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule arrived safely at the International Space Station, carrying 2 U.S. astronauts, a Russian cosmonaut, and a United Arab Emirates astronaut on a 6-month science mission. The crew is expected to carry out a series of studies that will help prepare for long-term manned expeditions to the moon, as well as carry out maintenance and repairs aboard the station, and prepare it for future crews and cargo, while assisting in the abandonment of astronauts who have been there so far. Among the crew, in addition to the 2 American astronauts, agencies note the presence of 41-year-old Sultan Al-Nayari from the United Arab Emirates, as well as 42-year-old Russian engineer Andrei Fedyaev. The latter is the second Russian cosmonaut to fly aboard a U.S. spacecraft under a renewed agreement between NASA and Roscosmos. Despite tensions between Washington and Moscow over Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the International Space Station has been operating for more than 20 years and is operated by a consortium that includes the U.S., Russia, Canada, Japan, and 11 European countries. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please stay tuned for Poland Daily Weather, Poland Daily Business, and some of our other programs. But for me, to have a wonderful weekend.